Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app. O'Connor and Company.
6:07, O'Connor and Company, and I just want to say this is the part of the program where I welcome our listeners and I tell them what's coming up. And usually that's focused on guests. But Patrice, can I just tell you something?
Yes.
We have a soundbite that I am so excited to play.
Okay.
It is something we've all been waiting for, Patrice Onwuka.
Okay.
It is 1 minute from Don Lemon's streaming podcast show with his special guest, Joy Reid. So we got
I can't,
recently
this gonna
fired.
Be a good one.
Oh, it's so good. I'm so excited. I've already done all my research to break it down, and it's like I cannot. I'm champing at the bit, for that matter. For those of you who know your equestrian terminology, so yes, recently fired primetime disgraced Joy Reid from MSNBC, appearing on recently fired disgraced primetime and morning host from CNN, Don Lemon. That's coming up. Also, I mean, if that's not enough, in 30 minutes we'll check in with Corey DeAngelis, who was in the East Room yesterday for the signing of an executive order dismantling the Department of Education. 7:35, Congressman from Ohio, Michael Rowley, and then 8:35, Molly Hemingway. As I've already pointed out, you are Patrice Onwuka, and I'm Larry O'Connor.
And it's a beautiful green Friday, springtime. I'm so excited. I'm so excited.
Here was not nearly as excited as the people who assembled at the White House yesterday for this historic moment. Cut 7, President Trump.
Today we take a very historic action that was 45 years in the making. In a few moments, I will sign an executive order to begin eliminating the Federal Department of Education once and for all.
And I got to tell you, optics is a word that's thrown around a lot when you do
Yes.
political analysis, and it's kind of a buzzword in Washington. But optics is, if you're sitting in a bar in Washington, in Washington they're nerds. Like yesterday was the NCAA basketball tournament, and in most of the bars in Washington, instead of having the games on with the sound down, they have like cable news running with the sound down.
Yeah, DC
and
is
people
a
are
unique
like,
beast. Yes.
It's ridiculous. You're drinking your beers in a bar in D.C. and you're reading the captions about, what the Secretary of Commerce said earlier today. What is wrong with our town? But optics means that if you're in one of those bars and you don't know exactly what's being said, but you see an image of the president or you see an image from the White House, and that image tells a story. And the optics yesterday of Trump in the East Room with the flags of each state behind him, representing who's really in charge of education in this country.
Yes.
And then as he sits at his desk to sign the executive order, there were like 20 assembled school desks with children.
Oh, it was
and like
so sweet.
big Sharpies in their hands
Yes.
as they signed their own version of the executive order. It was a beautiful sight to behold.
It was
and
masterful. And it reminds me, it's reminiscent of when he signed the executive order protecting women's sports, and he was flanked by a wall of female athletes of different ages, people who are very recognizable, some of my colleagues, but this is reminiscent of that. So whomever is doing their staging and their setup, kudos to you.
Yeah, it's been said that Donald Trump is actually one of the greatest television producers ever to be in the White House, and he's utilizing the optics and visuals and messaging of this electronic medium that he's done so well with, and utilizing the White House as basically a really cool TV studio. Yesterday's live audience, by the way, it was heartening to see so many friends of this program. Corey DeAngelis coming up in a few moments. I saw Terry Schilling and his giant brood there, Bethany Mandel and several of his kids. And talk about friends of the program. How about the grande dame of this program?
Yes.
Our executive producer, Heather Hunter, was there with her children, with Quinn and Bailey, and her husband, even Derek, put on a tie for the occasion. That was pretty cool. We'll hear from Heather Hunter a little bit later about what she saw in the East Room. But for everyone who is concerned about this, who's worried about this, who buying into the teachers union propaganda about this, first, a couple of things. Let's hear from our current president, Donald Trump, as he laid out the rationale for returning money without federal strings attached and without the bureaucracy impeding. delivering that money back to those 50 states represented by those flags, and recognizing that they can do a better job. They have done a better job. And boy, they certainly couldn't do any worse than what's been happening. Here's cut 8. Go.
After 45 years, the United States spends more money on education by far than any other country, and spends likewise by far more money per pupil than any country, and it's not even close. But yet we rank near the bottom of the list in terms of success. It's an amazing stat. Those are two stats you don't want. The most money spent per pupil, and you're at the bottom of the list. And that's where we are, like it or not. And we've been there for a long time. 70% of 8th graders are not proficient in either reading or in math. 70%. 40% of 4th graders lack even basic reading skills, can't read. Students in our public elementary and middle schools score worse in reading today than when the department opened, by a lot. In Baltimore, 40% of the high schools have 0 students who can do basic mathematics. Not even the very simplest of mathematics. I said, give me your definition of basic, and they're talking about like adding a few numbers together. Despite these breathtaking failures, the department's discretionary budget has exploded by 600% in a very short period of time, and it employs bureaucrats in buildings all over Washington, D.C. And as a former real estate person, I will tell you, I ride through the streets of Washington, and it says Department of Education, Department of Education. I said, how do you fill those buildings? It's crazy what's happened over the years.
Yeah, it is crazy, and it's a pastime that a Republican who, every single Republican in my lifetime, has promised to kill the Department of Education. Now we've got one who's doing it, and what's very telling, and we've got more sound here for you, but I'll just wrap up this portion here by telling you that when you hear everyone, you hear Randy Weingarten, you hear Democrats who are complaining about this, what they're not doing is saying, you can't cut the Department of Education because look at our track record. Look how great we've done. They're not saying that. They're not telling you all of the wonderful performance and all of the great achievements DOE has had. What they're doing is scaring you about what they're imagining might happen, especially to disabled special needs children, if you get rid of the Department of Education. That's a tell. They're not telling you what a great job they've done. They're scaring you about what they think might happen if you get rid of it. And I think that's very telling.
Well, listen, you're going to hear a number of falsehoods and lies, which number one is that you're going to cut teachers. I've heard people saying, well, I'm a teacher, my family's a teacher, we're going to lose our jobs. Randy Weingarten pointed to increased class sizes and cuts in teaching. That's not the case.
They always do.
And it's important to underscore, too, that a lot of these functions that are really important, and I do special needs kids, people who need who get unique services from the federal department, we do want to make sure, and I do think the administration recognizes those functions will move to other agencies. They won't disappear. They won't be eliminated. Those needs will be met. They just will be met through an agency that maybe has better jurisdiction over those specific issues. So, listen, we're going to hear a lot of hemming and hawing and a lot of trying out teachers and making it seem like teachers are now going to be all unemployed. Folks, don't fall for the lies.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then your complaint is with your local city, school board, county, or state government, not federal government.
How much do you trust your local officials? Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Who will be more accountable to you than some nameless, faceless bureaucrat in some big building that is way too expensive in Washington, D.C. All right, a little bit more. You're going to hear from Ronald Reagan, who had some thoughts about this 45 years ago. He wanted to get rid of this thing immediately. He wasn't able to do it. Trump got it done. You'll hear about it in a moment. First, though, at 6:15, WMAL. Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education in 1979. On his way out the door, it was right before he ran for re-election and lost in humiliating landslide fashion to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan ran at the time on the notion that this was a bad idea. It was going to harm education in America by making it centralized and controlled with strings attached to every dollar by bureaucrats. Of course, when you add those strings and add those middlemen, they cost money too, which means every dollar that was allocated for a child ends up getting diminished by the time it gets to that child because other people have dipped in. Reagan knew what he was doing, and he had a vision. Here he was in 1980.
I propose, and would have already started, if your hypothesis is correct, a planned and orderly transfer back to the states and local communities of functions the federal government has usurped and which it has proven it is incapable of operating. And one of the first of those would be welfare. One of the second would be in the field of education. I would like to dissolve the $10 billion National Department of Education created by President Carter and turn schools back to the local school districts where we built the greatest public school system the world has ever seen. I think I can make a case that the decline in the quality of public education began when federal aid became federal interference.
There you go.
Isn't it quaint to hear that it was a $10 billion
and look at it.
department?
Just think about this. Right now, the Department of Education oversees over $1 trillion for the student loan program. $1 trillion. That's just one slice of what's happening. You know, it was interesting. I was on a call with the White House about this rollout, and what they really underscored when we talk about driving education back down to the state level and the local level, it's that there is so much innovation and successful experimentation going on in a lot of states that they can copy one another. States like, I think Louisiana was one that was mentioned, where they're innovating new ways to get kids to increase literacy to the point where those literacy rates are turning around. One state can borrow from another or tweak it to work to hit some of those really strong problem areas in education. And so, you know, I think it's so important for us to understand that it is not eliminating, it's about eliminating the bureaucracy and the extra layers and making sure that at the local level, those who have great ideas are able to run with more money, more funding, rather than having it getting caught up in the layers of bureaucracy in Washington, or worse, getting turned down because, you know, your state is a red state and it's a blue administration.
Yesterday on his show, Glenn Beck actually did something super instructive and, if I may, educational. He read from the original piece of legislation that created the Department of Education. It was the Department of Education Organization Act. This is the founding document of this federal bureaucracy. And I want you to listen to these words, and you tell me if something went awry, and also recognize what the legislators, what Jimmy Carter, what the Democrats had to say to sell this to the American people in 1979. Listen to this. The establishment of the Department of Education shall not increase the authority of the federal government over education or diminish the responsibility for education, which is reserved to the states and the local school systems and other instrumentalities of the states. Does anyone believe that the Department of Education has stayed true to that founding principle? The strings they attach and the control that they put on education. Now, we all saw it play out during the pandemic.
Yes.
What they did with the federal funding. And, of course, the states and the local municipalities became so dependent on this, you know, the crack pipe of federal funding that they're like, okay, we'll do whatever you tell us. Just give us the money. Just give us the money. We'll do whatever you tell us to do. Yeah. And that's the problem.
Well, and
one more quick quote from this act, real fast. It is the intention of the Congress and the establishment of the department to protect the rights of state and local governments and public and private educational institutions and improve the control of such governments and institutions over their own educational programs or policies. It's done the exact opposite. And that's what happens with federal bureaucracies. Well,
and part of it is when they're ideologically driven. I mean, all of these dear colleague letters from the Obama administration to the Biden administration really drove home these ideological initiatives, from DEI to, you know, Title IX rewrites around sports to, you know, dealing with how you deal with sexual assaults at the K through 12 level. It's been crazy.
All right, we're all over this story today. It was historic yesterday. We're going to speak with Corey DeAngelis coming up in just a few moments. Plus, we're going to speak to a congressman who's actually going to try to take this executive order and turn it into law at 7:35, Representative Michael Robby. And we'll speak with our very own Heather Hunter, who was in the room where it happened, right now at 6:23.
Now on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app. O'Connor and Company.
It's 6:37. It's O'Connor and Company here on WMAL, starting your day the right way. Thank you for being part of what we do and letting us be a part of what you're doing. Coming up at 7:35, we're going to check in with Ohio Congressman Michael Robby. He is working on legislation right now to enshrine yesterday's executive order into law, permanently ending the Department of Education. At 8:35, Molly Hemingway of The Federalist will join us. It's Larry O'Connor with Patrice Onwuka.
Good morning. Happy Friday, Larry.
Thank you, Patrice. Right back at you. Joining us right now is a champion for education freedom in America. He was, of course, in the East Room for this. He's a senior fellow at the American Culture Project and executive director of Educational Freedom Institute. He's Corey DeAngelis. Corey, that must have been quite a moment there in the East Room.
Oh, it was fantastic. What a glorious day yesterday. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Randi Weingarten, one of your favorites, president of the American Federation for Teachers, it looks like there's two tactics. First, she said, see you in court. So they'll be suing, I guess, over an executive order. I don't know exactly what that lawsuit is, but God knows they can find a judge. And the other thing, and I think it's a tell, the defenders of the Department of Education are not pointing to their track record and saying, look at all the great things this department has done. What instead they're doing is trying to scare people about what could happen now that it's going to be dismantled. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's a bunch of baseless fear-mongering, and a lot of the Democrats and the teachers' unions are trying to use this as an opportunity to campaign against their political opponents. You can also call it Trump derangement syndrome if you want, but what they're doing is they're building a straw man and arguing against that instead of the actual proposal, because the actual proposal is a good idea, so they can't use that. They have to argue against something that's not actually happening. So what they're saying is, oh, this is going to defund education, and this is going to take away vital programs for special needs kids. It does none of those things. First of all, the money's block granted back to the states, and so you'd actually have more money to spend on education if you're wasting less of it on useless bureaucrats pushing paper in D.C. Yeah. Each individual state has a Department of Education already. We don't need to spend more money on another one in D.C. It's redundant. And for special needs students, that program would move under the Department of Health and Human Services, and this is clear in the bill in Congress right now by Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from South Dakota. So all of these things that they're arguing about, it's covered. It moves under a different department, civil rights protections under the Department of Justice, and so on and so forth.
Corey, I'm so glad that you laid out some of those concerns, because I have friends who work in education, and those are some of the things they're asking about. What happens to, Title I, I believe they talk about what happens to special needs funding. And then we also hear, this is needed because what happens at the local level, you can't trust your local officials. What do you say? What's your response? Because, and I think there's an interesting tease there, which is, well, you're going to have red states and blue states who probably do approach education very differently. And so do you end up having kind of divergent education systems? And is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, it can't get any worse than what's happening right now in the blue states anyway. So it's not like the Federal Department of Education is creating this utopian version of an education system today. So that could be said with the special needs programs today. They're failing the kids with special needs all across the country right now. And so just because we have something on paper with a stated purpose, I mean, the whole purpose of the department was to close achievement gaps and to improve student outcomes. It hasn't done either of those things. All it's done is create more bureaucracy and throw more money at the problem. It's a definition of insanity. They've spent about $2 trillion since the inception. It was created in 1979 as a political payoff by Jimmy Carter to the NEA, the largest labor union, teacher union in the country. And so we have to look at the actual results, and the proof is in the pudding. Their time is up. It's time to try something different, and it's unconstitutional anyway. The word education is not in the Constitution. Let's send it back to the states. We'll have more money into the classroom than we had before. And look, local control is a good thing. If you don't trust your local representatives, why in the heck would you trust someone thousands of miles away further in D.C. that has no incentive to care about anything that you have to say?
Yeah.
Corey DeAngelis is our guest. And Corey, of course, you're very proactive with regard to education freedom and with regard to school choice and trying to work with states to move toward giving that money back to the parents' hands so they can make their educational choices. How does this help that effort, in your opinion?
Yeah, it puts wind at the school choice movement, at the sails of the movement, but it doesn't directly impact school choice. There is a theory that it could indirectly impact school choice, and Randi Weingarten herself put this forward on a podcast, really showing her cards as to why she's concerned about the department going away. She even conceded on that podcast that, well, they say the money will be block granted back to the states, but she's concerned that some states, like my home state of Texas, which she called out specifically, might use the funding and not just give it back to the states, but give it back to the parents. They might use it for school choice. And, oh, goodness, it's not going to go to her union-controlled schools, and that's what she's concerned about. She wants the money for herself. She is paid over $500,000 a year. She goes and when the Nation's report card scores came out a couple years ago showing decades of learning loss because of her union-induced school closures, she fled to Ukraine, probably using taxpayer or indirectly taxpayer-funded union dues to do so. She's a political project, not an education guru, and our results show it. So that's their real concern. But there's also a separate proposal in Congress, Educational Choice for Children Act. It's supported by Trump, Speaker Mike Johnson, the Senate President as well, and that would expand school choice. So that's what I'm looking at as well. These are separate proposals, but they're both good ones.
All right, Corey, we got to leave it there. Do you want to just say something real fast, Patrice, though?
I loved your take on all those Dear Colleague letters that have really instituted partisan ideology. Do those go away with the elimination of the Department of Education?
Yeah, well, you can still point to the laws, but you just want to have as much teeth, I guess, attached to the funding. But at the end of the day, each state's going to need to fix their education systems. Most of the funding is at the state and local level, and school choice is really making a wave in red states right now, with 15 red states passing universal school choice in the past 4 years alone. Wow. So we can thank Randi Weingarten for showing parents what happened in the schools.
And Fauci and the overreach by the bureaucrats over our children during the pandemic. Had the pandemic not happened, I don't think this would have happened yesterday. Yes. Corey DeAngelis, thank you, sir. Great talking with you. It's 6:44.
Thank you.
Robby Starbuck, we've talked about Robby quite a bit. He's sort of a one-man wrecking crew when it comes to DEI and corporations who embrace values that are contrary to their consumer base. Well, the FCC under new chairman Brendan Carr has teamed up with Robby Starbuck. Get this. They're going to stamp out DEI in the telecommunications sector. So if there are corporations who are involved under the FCC's jurisdiction who are forcing DEI policies onto employees, they're up for scrutiny and potential corrections from the FCC. Does that include radio companies by any chance?
I believe it. Yes, I do believe so. So
if you're a radio company, a corporation that owns a lot of radio stations, and you force a bunch of DEI training on employees.
It's
I'm just asking for a friend.
It's very possible. Okay. So Carr has already opened. Checking. He has already opened an investigation into Comcast and NBC Universal over some of what the companies have been promoting in their DEI policies, whether you're talking about the trainings or you're talking about the hiring representation targets. There are lots of ways that DEI has worked its way into the corporate culture. And so this is another way. I mean, we've seen him go after beer and retail companies, and now it's interesting to go after the providers of so many forms of the entertainment that we consume and the content we consume.
If they have a direct connection to getting a license to broadcast and
or
something
mergers,
that the FCC would have oversight to.
Yeah.
Sure, I think I've said everything I want to say about this. It's 6:52.